In this video, we are going to a house that sits on a hill in southern Illinois, near Equality, known by three names: Hickory Hill, the Crenshaw House, and, most infamously, the Old Slave House. Even before you know the history, the building looks wrong in the way certain places do. It stands exposed, elevated, and still, as if it has spent nearly 2 centuries watching the land below and refusing to forget what passed through it. But the fear attached to this house does not begin with a ghost story. It begins with American history at its most brutal, in a state that was supposed to be free. The house is associated with John Hart Crenshaw, a wealthy southern Illinois businessman whose fortune came from salt. In the early 19th century, the Gallatin County region was valuable for its saline springs, and salt was serious money. The state leased these resources to operators, and Crenshaw became one of the major figures in that system. Illinois was technically a free state, but the reality on the ground was far uglier. According to the Illinois Historic Site Summary, African Americans formed the bulk of the labor that powered Crenshaw's operation, and the evidence strongly suggests he went beyond even the racist laws of the time and helped seize free or fugitive African Americans so they could be sold into slavery. That is what makes this story so chilling. The Crenshaw House is not just linked to slavery in the ordinary sense of the word. It is linked to the reverse Underground Railroad. Most people know the Underground Railroad as a desperate route toward freedom. The reverse version was the nightmare mirror of that story, a system in which free black people and escaped slaves were abducted and moved south into bondage. The National Park Service describes the Crenshaw House as a station on that reverse network and says it is thought Crenshaw operated a secret slave jail for kidnapped free black people and captured runaways on the 3rd floor of the house. That 3rd floor is where the legend takes hold. It was a holding area, a hidden prison inside what otherwise looked like a grand home. Once people began to imagine what it would mean for people to be held above the main living quarters, behind walls and doors, in a place built by a wealthy man in a supposedly free state, the house stopped being just a house. It became a symbol, a wound with architecture. The historical record, though, is where the story becomes more complicated. For kidnapping and holding a black woman and her children until they could be moved south, he was acquitted. But the state's summary says the evidence strongly suggests he was connected to illegally holding African Americans. The National Park Service goes even broader, saying period documents confirm his involvement in the disappearances of freed black people whose victims later surfaced across the slaveholding South. The debate is not whether Crenshaw was surrounded by darkness. The debate is how much of the darkest version of the house can be proven exactly as later legend told it. The Crenshaw House became one of those places where real cruelty and embellished memory fused together. Southern Illinois University archaeologists later described the site as being at the center of dozens of sensational stories, some true, many probably not. Their later reporting challenged some of the most repeated claims about the 3rd floor. According to SIU, architectural evidence suggested those upper rooms were finished at the same time as the rest of the house, and were not necessarily built as a hidden jail from the beginning. Researchers also documented 19th century graffiti there, including poems and messages from teenage girls, suggesting people were not always treating the space as a forbidden chamber of terror. That does not erase the horror, it sharpens it, because SIU's conclusion was not that no one was ever held there. It was narrower, and, in some ways, more haunting. They said they could not say no one was ever held there against their will, but they could say that was not necessarily why the third floor had originally been built that way. In other words, the space may not have been born as a prison, yet history and memory turned it into one. And if you are telling this story for Supernatural Sunday, that is gold. Because now the house is not just a haunted object. It is a place where architecture, cruelty, rumor, fear, and grief layered themselves on top of one another until no one can fully separate them. By the time the house was being shown to visitors in the 20th century, the haunting stories had a life of their own. A 1998 Daily Egyptian account says people reported hearing cries, whimpering, and even rattling chains coming from the attic after the old slave house opened to tourists in 1926. That same article describes later reports of whispering, sudden cold areas in the attic, even during summer, and ghostly presences felt on the third floor. The details are classic, haunting language, but what makes them stick is the context. These are not random bumps in an old house. The alleged sounds mirror exactly what later visitors believe had happened there: captivity, fear, pleading, confinement. One of the most repeated themes in stories about the house is that people did not just feel frightened there, they felt watched. The article recounts claims from investigator Troy Taylor and editor Gary Daniel, both of whom described strange temperature shifts and a powerful unease on the third floor. Again, none of that proves anything supernatural, but it tells you how the house functions in the imagination. People go in already carrying the weight of the story, and the building gives them enough silence, enough isolation, enough dark corners to let that story breathe. In a place like this, even a draft feels personal. The deep question is whether places can absorb moral trauma, whether repeated acts of cruelty, fear, and silence can change how a building is remembered forever. The National Park Service itself does not certify ghosts, obviously, but it does say the terrible fates of kidnapped free black people and enslaved laborers are the origin of the persistent rumors that the house is haunted. That is a remarkable phrase. Not that the house is haunted because of folklore alone, but that the rumors grow directly out of historical suffering. The real terror is already there. A wealthy man operating in a free state, a labor empire built on racial exploitation, strong evidence of illegal seizures. A third floor tied, whether perfectly or imperfectly, to the memory of human beings held against their will. Even if every chain sound were explained away by timber and wind, even if every cold spot turned out to be an old draft, the place would still feel haunted because the history itself has never been morally resolved. There is also something unsettling about the house's current state. It is state-owned but closed to the public. Official sources listed as not open, and SIU noted years ago that the house and grounds were not open to the public even during archaeological work. So the building remains physically present but inaccessible, visible but sealed off, famous but unreachable, that only feeds the mythology. A closed place always invites imagination. People cannot test the story for themselves, so the story grows in the dark, gathering strength with every retelling. If this house were only a legend, it would be easier to dismiss. If it were only a historical site, it would be easier to classify. But it lives in the uncomfortable space between the two. The archaeologists complicate the legend. The state record confirms the exploitation. The National Park Service preserves the link to the reverse Underground Railroad, and local ghost lore keeps insisting that whatever happened there did not leave cleanly. So what do we do with a place like the Crenshaw House? Maybe the honest answer is that we do not need to prove a ghost to admit a haunting. A building can be haunted by memory, by rumor, by historical violence, by the weight of what a community knows and cannot comfortably say out loud. In that sense, the third floor matters whether it was purpose-built as a cell block or not. Because in the public imagination, that upper level became the place where the truth of the house concentrated into one image. People above you, unseen, waiting, trapped, unheard. And perhaps that is why the reports are so specific. Not random banging, but cries. Not vague, bad energy, but whispers. Not just shadows, but the sense of unseen presence in the hottest part of summer where cold should not exist. These are the kinds of stories people tell when a place has become a vessel for moral memory. The details may shift over decades, but the emotional shape remains the same. Suffering above, silence below, and a house that still feels as though it is holding something back. There is a temptation with stories like this to choose a side. Either declare every haunting report false, or surrender completely to the paranormal version. I do not think the Crenshaw House works that way. The house is terrifying, regardless of where you land on ghosts. If you are a skeptic, it is a monument to how real atrocity mutates into folklore. If you believe in hauntings, it is exactly the kind of place where psychic residue would take root. And if you are somewhere in the middle, it is one of those rare sites where the documented past is grim enough to make the supernatural feel almost secondary. That house is still standing on the hill, closed, exposed, and heavy with meanings that do not sit neatly together. The Crenshaw House may or may not hold the voices people claim to hear, but it unquestionably holds the echo of a system that should never have existed in a free state, and the memory of lives treated as property, moved like cargo, and nearly erased. Maybe that is the true haunting.